glad to hear everything.
Thanks, Nick. I appreciate it. It's nice to see all you guys here as well. You're also helping me with the graduation requirement for my program. There'll be a QR code at the end for you to give a little survey of my talk, so feel free to participate in that. But as Nick said, my name is Bryce Murray. I'm a second-year genetic counseling student at Stanford University. I graduated from Point Loma in 2020. If you're a senior, that means you went to school with me. If you're anything younger than that, that means I did not go to school with you, which is a very odd thing to say because I still feel like I'm in my undergrad. Anyway, what we'll do today is go through a little introduction about me, what I did at Point Loma, what I thought about doing when I was at Point Loma, where I really thought my career would be and where it would go. We'll go through genetic counseling, what it is, who does genetic counseling, when you would go see a genetic counselor, why you would go see a genetic counselor, how do you become a genetic counselor. My goal is to make this helpful for anyone here who plans on applying to grad school, not just planning on applying to grad school for genetic counseling, because I know that we're all interested in a whole bunch of different things. So I'll be sure to touch on that. And then we'll also go through different careers in biology that you guys can think about, especially pertaining to genetics. I am a nerd for specifically genetics, so I apologize. It is going to be skewed that way. Molecular biology, biochemistry, organic chemistry, kill me now please. It's just not something that I enjoy doing. But when I was at Point Loma, I don't know if you all feel this way too, but it seemed as if there were only really two paths. You could go into medicine, or you could go the PhD route and do research. I don't know if that rings true for you guys as well. There's so many different career fields within biology. I don't know if you all are biology grads. Is anyone anything other than bio or biochem here? All biology? What's your major?
Psychology.
Great. Psychology is great too. My minor was in psychology, pre-therapeutic psychology, and Dr. Page played a large part in allowing me to get that. She texted, messaged some psych profs and said, Bryce doesn't need these prereqs, just put them in your class. And they did. So again, I graduated from 2020. You can see there at the bottom, masks, the relic of the past for some. At Stanford, not so much. But here, thankfully, we don't have to cover our spaces and talk. But I graduated in the midst of COVID, which meant that my plans on going straight to grad school were somewhat interrupted. What I did instead was I did a gap year. If you are someone who is not sure what they want to do, not sure what they want to specialize in when it comes to grad school, I cannot recommend taking a gap year enough. It was great. I found a job listing on Craigslist, of all places, for a very small lab in Mira Mesa, a little bit north towards La Jolla. And what I did there was a lot of antibody research. I would do a lot of cloning of DNA vectors and would basically amplify all the DNA that we created. If anyone's done a mini prep, a maxi prep, something like that, I did those day in and day out. It was smelly, but a good time. I worked in a very small lab. It was myself, and then I think there were 5 other people in there. It was a great job. It was a really good experience. Got my foot in the door of genetics because I had all of that experience there. And ultimately, the head of the lab that I was working with, he helped me as well with my grad school application. And so when you get that real world experience, you figure out what you enjoy, that can be really beneficial as well. And honestly, in the lab setting, I don't know, I think that at school I was thinking to myself, you know, I'm not sure if I really enjoy being at a lab bench. I don't know if I want that to be the rest of my life. I really enjoy talking to people. The interpersonal relationships are great. I am not an extrovert, however, I love talking with people. So to be a genetic counselor, a lot of people are very much out there and super extroverted, but you do not need to be that if you want to become one. So just keep that in mind. But I thought, you know, how do I get a job that combines people and combines genetics? My favorite subject, my favorite thing to do is talk. So I Googled high-paying jobs with genetics and people, and I saw genetic counseling. I think once I also brought it up to Dr. Page, who was my academic advisor at Point Loma, and we talked about it briefly, but it just turned into Googling more, figuring out more about genetic counseling, what it is, where I can apply to do grad programs for it, and now here we are. So we'll get more into the grad school application process a little bit later, but that's about me, how I kind of arrived there. But really, who are genetic counselors and when would you really see one? Well, This is my class at Stanford. Just like Point Loma, I still stick out like a sore thumb, but it's just fine. Genetic counselors really are the medical specialists that are trained in genetics. The best way to explain it to someone, if you've heard of PAs, genetic counselors are PAs for the genetics clinic. So we're a little bit more specialized in that sense. We do not prescribe medication, but we do diagnose patients. And those are the big differences between PA and genetic counselors. But other than that, what we do is we assess patient risk for a variety of different conditions. We do treatments for conditions as well, so we'll recommend them. We won't do the application, though. We'll pass them off to a nurse or a doctor to apply that. But a lot of what we also do is the emotional side of seeing patients. Psychology plays a big role. When it comes to medical ethics, we also are very much interested in navigating that sticky situation of the medical field. We talk about abortion, we talk about pregnancy termination, we talk about terminal diagnosis, we talk about end-of-life care. We go into the idea of consent versus assent, figuring out when you should tell a minor whether or not they have a condition that is going to end up ending their life before they turn 20. Is not something that people really think about when they go into see the doctor, but it's something that's on the mind of a genetic counselor pretty much every day. That does depend on the clinic, though. What we're really worried about is providing personalized care for your genetic health. Ideally, in the future, we really hope to get to the point where you come in and you get your finger pricked, and from that blood sample, we can go into a whole different slew of different things that you can look into. Pharmacogenetics. If you've ever heard of people saying, oh, Benadryl actually gets me super hyper, or Benadryl makes me really sleepy, or Benadryl makes me really itchy. That has to do with your genes, fun fact. Everyone's wired differently. Everyone has different receptors that gets into the protein structure. If you've had Dr. Durrell, fold equals function. That is very true within genetics as well, and it never stops being true. So keep those small little tidbits from your professors at Point Loma in the back of your brains whenever you're going into grad school, and if you're going into a job as well, it can play a big role. We also do a lot of patient decision-making facilitation. So when someone comes in, they say, well, I kind of want to know, but I also kind of don't want to know. It's like, well, you're the worst, but let's work through this and figure out what we want to decide. Do you want to know your fate? Obviously, your genetics are not your fate, but they can play a big role in when you're going to pass away. A whole lot of scary neurological conditions. We can talk about cases a little bit later on if that's something you guys want to hear about more, but there's a lot involved within the medical field and genetics that have to do with patient emotions, and we're experts in that area. Genetic counseling really, at the end of the day, is the process of helping people understand and adapt to the medical, psychological, and familial implications of genetic contributions to disease. That is the definition that the NSGC, the National Society for Genetic Counselors, uses whenever trying to explain to people what genetic counselors are, because again, not everyone's really heard of genetic counseling. I don't know, show of hands, who heard of genetic counseling before they came here? Okay, that's good. That's more than what it used to be, for sure. But again, it's those two parts. It's genetics and it's the counseling. We interpret family data. I can't tell you how many pedigrees I've made so far. It is ridiculous. But they really are, even though they're such an old-fashioned tool, they're super helpful, even to this day, in helping us determine what risk is, whether or not something might be running in your family, figuring out if it's recessive, figuring out if it's dominant, using those clues to help diagnose patients. There's also a big educational component when it comes to genetic counseling. We have to explain to patients what recessive conditions are, what is a dominant condition, why we think that this condition that so obviously skipped a generation didn't really skip a generation, what a carrier is, everything involved in genetics. We have to do that education to a patient, and we have to be able to do that at different levels. So you can see patients who have PhDs in biology. At Stanford, of course, we have very highly educated individuals. We also see people that don't have extensive educational backgrounds, dealing with Central Californian farmers that haven't been to high school, that don't know how to read. You have to, on the fly, switch your analogy of what genes are from, oh, it's a book and all the sentences are our genes, and you can imagine that if there was a chapter missing, that would be have a problem with the story. You have to switch that because they don't know like what a book is. They don't read. So switching that to maybe a baking analogy or the passing of time, something like that. There's a lot that you have to do on the fly, and that makes it really fun, but that can also make it fairly difficult. The counseling part again, promoting informed choices for patients, making sure that with the education, they understand each piece that they're hearing and why it would matter to them. That's also part of the genetic counselor's job, is that explaining of these different variables and what it might mean for different. You can see a genetic counselor in a variety of different environments. You can see it from embryos. We do PGD, pre-genetic implantation diagnostic testing for embryos. We also do it for newborns. If you've ever seen a pregnant patient, if you've been pregnant yourself, you know that the amniocentesis, the CVS, the NIPT testing, we can actually take blood samples, amniotic fluid samples, and diagnose patients before they're even born, which is awesome. At the same time, that then leads into pregnancy, termination, abortion conversations, and so it gets a little bit tricky there as well. You can diagnose children with conditions that will not affect them until they are 60. You can diagnose children with conditions that are going to start affecting them immediately. There is no limitation to the broadness of impacts that genetics can have on patients. Adults can also come in for diagnosis as well to a genetics clinic. That's typically within the cancer realm. You notice that, oh, my sister had breast cancer at 40, and my mom also had ovarian cancer, and I'm just wanting to know my own risk because I'm turning 38, and it's about the same age that they started developing symptoms, so let's get this checked out. Turns out a patient might have a mutation that means that they're predisposed to developing that cancer, and so that leads to different screening for them. We also can do post-mortem testing. Again, cancer clinic, typically when patients have passed away from a condition and the family wants closure, we can do testing for that. Another case example I'll go into a little bit later, we did the exact same thing. There is, again, no limitation to the broadness of the scope to which genetics can be tested. You can have things as small as single gene testing. Even smaller still, you can go into specific sites within those genes to look and see whether or not the changes present are the ones that are running in the family. You can make small panels that are looking at about 5 to 10 genes at a time. You can have large panels that are looking at about 100 to 250 genes at a time. And then you can go into the really fun stuff, which is the exome and genome sequencing that's looking at every single gene in your body, introns, exons, etc. That gets into the high specificity versus low specificity, but we do testing for all different types. It'll change depending on what clinic you're at, but again, it also can change depending on what the patient wants to know. If they want to know all about their genes, if they only want to know specifically about this condition, stuff like that. Genetic testing is also utilized for a variety of different reasons. You've got risk management, again with the cancer stuff, personal preparation, family planning. If a patient's going to have a condition that's definitely going to affect them by the time they're 50 and they want to live their life within that time range, then that's information that they can have. There are a lot of neurological conditions that affect people in that way. When it comes to insurance, you can also get yourself tested if you present with certain symptoms, and if you are found to have a mutation, your family members can get tested as well. So it can be beneficial for not just yourself, but also many people involved in the process that are going to be going to treatments with you, or maybe you're worried about your kids having the same condition that you are, stuff like that. As well as with the treatment, the informed decisions, we talked about a little bit about that already, but the long and short of it is that you can see a genetic counselor for a variety of different reasons, during a multitude of different stages in life. And again, testing can be super specific or incredibly broad. So why would you want to become a genetic counselor? Genetics, obviously, it's the best subject out there. I'm sure you all love it. And is anyone in genetics right now, or is that a first semester thing? No one? Okay, that's fine. Great class. Dr. Page teaches it. So is Dr. Linebeck. Am I getting that right? Okay, great. She's awesome too. It's super interesting. And then when you can take genetics and sort of sprinkle in those psychological systems, different styles of therapy, different counseling techniques, it becomes really fun. Again, the interpersonal aspect of genetic counseling is also a really good time. I realized I really didn't want to be in the lab all the time because I like talking to people, and so this is the perfect marrying of those two, which is really great. Going back to, has anyone heard of Theranos before? Yeah, no one? It's a little older. There's a Netflix documentary on it. It was this idea that you could, again, get your finger pricked and they would be able to tell if you have cancer or a variety of different conditions. That turned out to be a scam, actually, but now Stanford's at the point where we think we've developed what we titled Theranos that works. So I worked in the lab that developed the product. I don't think it's a scam. You never know when it comes to genetics and biotech, but we'll see. Genetics is, in my opinion, the future of medicine, because if you can develop those testings, the tests that detect things before they're even present, that can be a big deal. It can affect different screenings, can affect different therapies that you utilize, and different medicines that you can use as well. Has anyone in here pre-med? Nice, a couple of hands go up. I'm sure that you have thought to yourself, well, med school is about 8 years long. That for me was too long. If it's right for you, it's right for you, and that's great. But if you are like me and you think, well, I don't know if I want a PhD because I want to work, but also I need an advanced degree in order to be getting these future jobs that I really want to have. Genetic counseling is a 2-year program. It's about a 2.5-year time commitment, to be honest, because you have to work summer as well as the summer after you graduate studying for boards. Does anyone know what the NCLEX test is for nursing? So end of the year board exam they have to take in order to get their license. Similar thing happens with genetic counseling. You have to take an end of the year board exam that gives you your license in order to practice. So that's why we say 2 to 2.5 years that the time takes. Again, I Googled high-paying jobs in genetics and people. So the average pay for a genetic counselor is nationally about $102,000 per year, which I thought was pretty good. In California, you can get up to about 110, 115. And then there are other different jobs that you can do within the genetic counseling field that pay even higher or pay lower depending on your specialty, depending on what you're doing with your job, stuff like that. It also is a lot less debt than med school would be, or well, PhD programs, typically they're paying you to be there, so would recommend looking into those programs. But if you're, for some reason, on a non-scholarship PhD course, genetic counseling is a much more financially stable option. And then, like I was talking about just a second ago, the career opportunities are very broad. There's a large assortment of different career opportunities that you can take when it comes to genetic counseling. I'll touch on those a little bit later as well. So I bet you're all wondering, how do you become a genetic counselor? So you apply to grad school, what does that look like? When it comes to applying for grad school programs involved in genetic counseling, has anyone heard of the match service before? It's a big deal because they just did the med school match service. They just released those results. Genetic counseling also has the match service as well. In order to apply, it's recommended that you have a biology or a psychology degree. There's a girl in my program who has a philosophy degree. There's another girl in my program who has an agricultural degree. So there is no requirement for what your undergraduate degree is. It's just recommended for the background, the sake of background and prereq courses that you need to have, you be in biology or psychology. The list of courses you got to take, obviously general bio education, biochem, genetics courses, psychology, sociology courses, and some form of statistics or, biostatistics. If you are looking at certain schools, typically it comes along with prestige, you will have to take 2 semesters of organic chemistry. Sucks, but that's also involved there too. When it comes to GPA, most schools are looking for about 3.6 or higher. That'll vary between schools, depending on prestige or how selective they are. There are certain schools like the University of Arizona that require you to have a 3.85, which in my opinion is ridiculous. But like I said, it all depends. When it comes to the GRE, it's not required anymore. Congrats. I would recommend still taking it, depending on what you're going to apply to. If it's feasible for you and if it's within your abilities, I would recommend taking it after you graduate. I think that doing it when you're fresh out of school, you still have maybe that math brain going on. I took a year to take it and realized I don't remember anything about geometry, and so I have to retake all these geometry crash courses and stuff like that. But depending on where you're applying, it can be helpful. If you don't score well on it, just leave it off. It's great. So no one's going to ask you your GRE score unless it's on paper. You've got to write it down yourself. When it comes to the application process, What happens is you will apply in late November. This is true for most grad programs, whether you're going for a PhD or a different kind of master's course. Those applications will be sent in, you'll finish up, and then in about December, early January, you'll start receiving some emails saying, hey, we think that you're interesting. Would you like to, have a phone conversation so we can figure out if you're a real person and if you can talk to people? And that's step one, is that phone conversation, typically. The interviews can be anywhere from January to March. If you're like me and you applied to 8 different schools, and then you got denial letters from 7 different schools up until the day before your final interview with your final school, it can get a little nerve-wracking. So I would say do not be discouraged. There are a lot of people who apply to grad programs multiple years in a row. A lot of people at Stanford that did not get in their first time. So just keep that in mind. Don't be afraid, don't be discouraged, keep going. If you're really about it, you're gonna keep on going as much as you want. And yeah, so that's something to keep in mind there too. Once you have gone through the whole interview process, it typically involves, like I said, the phone call to figure out who you are, what you like, if you're a normal person or not. Then you get on to, for me, it was during COVID, so Zoom interviews, or they'll invite you to the school to do an interview. Those can take multiple forms. Stanford did a group interview. There were 18 of us on the same Zoom call. And that was the weirdest experience I've ever had. I've never seen more, I would guess the best word for it is bodacious personalities on display than ever before. Everyone's competing. It's very passive aggressive. It's a super fun time, but once you get past it, you get past it. And so when you get those acceptance and denial letters in late April, the emails then begin. This is, hopefully you'll see a picture similar to this one. This is my acceptance email that I got there. And they tell you what program you got into. When you're applying to schools, make sure that you are thinking about where you are okay with living for the next 2 to 4 years. If you love San Diego like me, and you apply to Northern California programs and programs all across the United States, you realize quite quickly, oh shoot, I'm not going to be in San Diego for a very long time. So that's something to keep in mind. If you aren't an East Coast person, if you are an East Coast person, if you aren't a cold weather person, I have friends that are in Montana and Utah, and winter is terrible for them. So a little bit different from San Diego, as you can imagine, I'm sure. So what does grad school look like for me? It's been a lot of courses, a lot of classes. Stanford's really unique in that they do something called just-in-time learning. What that means is that I got to get into clinic the second quarter I was there. The first quarter was a lot of classes, a lot of coursework. We had medical courses, we had psych courses, we had public health courses, as well as the online learning. Those med courses were taught by PhDs, MDs, genetic counselors, nurse practitioners, a whole host of different people that are involved in hospital work. We're teaching courses like embryology, fetal development, child onset genetic conditions, stuff like that. Then we had psych courses. We had psychotherapists, we had psychiatrists, we had a shrink come in one time, that was very interesting, talking about how people respond to different counseling techniques, what works, what doesn't work. Those were a lot of fun too. Gets into the psychology things. I think, is it Bowenian psychology? I'm not sure if that's I don't know. Anyway, you go into what works, what doesn't, and that's a fun time as well. You can also learn about the sociological implications that has to do with the public health courses. As you can imagine, genetics is a very European field. We do not have very large databases, which means that when we're testing people who do not look like me, the results cannot be as accurate. So it has to do a lot with getting out into the public, talking with people about why we would want their information, trying to build out those databases so that we can give the best care to the most people at all times possible. Then it comes to the online learning. My first ever rotation was in a medical genetics clinic for pediatrics. What that meant was they assigned me to do a pediatric genetics course online for the first 3 weeks before I started my rotation. Did that get done in those 3 weeks? No, but it got done within the first 2 weeks of the rotation. And it's a crash course, 100%, which I enjoy. It's at your own pace. You can take as many notes as you want. You can rewatch lectures and seminars. A lot of different schools do that now, which is a lot of fun. But all schools do it differently. This was just, my experience. So this was my first quarter class schedule. We have a journal club at 12:30 on Monday, and then a seminar at 3:15. That seminar is supposed to end at 4:30. It went until 5:30, a lot. When it comes to Wednesday, I'm sure the first thing you see is role-playing courses. That has to do with those psychology classes. Stanford will do it, and a lot of genetic counseling programs will make it so that, and a lot of med school programs will make it so that you are getting experience before you even go into the medical clinic. You will talk to theater majors, you will talk to acting majors, you will talk to professional actors who are given a note card, and they say, this is your condition, these are the findings. You can give them this piece of information, be coy about everything else. And so I can't tell you how frustrated I have been talking to some girl that's sitting across the table from me, or some guy that's sitting at this round table with multiple other people, and they just aren't really sure what they're supposed to tell me and what they're not supposed to tell me, but it's good experience in managing expectations of patients, because you never really know what you're going to get. So it gets really fun, it's very unique, and I like it a lot. You also have the typical courses that you might expect, like advanced molecular genetics, intro to medical genetics as well, and other seminars sprinkled in there too. We do a little bit of more PhD-centric, like genetic testing lab work, but that's very minimal within the genetic counseling field. We're not experts in those processes. We just sort of say, we know that this works and we can get these results from it, so that's what we're going to do. And it's kind of nice that way, because you get to skip all the mumbo jumbo and don't have to get too into the weeds about it. But I thought that was a lot of fun. Once you start rotations, it can get really hectic, but that's the best part, is that hands-on personal experience that you can have with actual patients in clinic. Like I said, I started in a pediatric clinic, I then went to a prenatal clinic, I then worked with cardiovascular connective tissues. Has anyone heard of Marfan syndrome before? Bose-Dietz syndrome or anything like that? When it comes to the patient interactions that I had, they got really interesting. Within genetics, you'd be surprised how many patients you work with that have incestuous relationships. Prenatal clinic especially, that was a big deal. We had a couple come in who had a child with large regions of homozygosity, meaning that there was a lot of similarity in their kids' genes, and we thought, oh, maybe there's something going on here, parents are related. Parents say, no, we're not related. Turns out they're also from the same very small rural village from India, and they had both come over at the same time. So we thought, oh, that's interesting. Wonder what's going on here. Couldn't really get an answer from the information they gave us, so then we asked them again, is there any possibility that maybe your parents, your grandparents were related by blood before they were married? No, no chance whatsoever. They leave, and about 15 minutes afterwards, our clinic gets a call from the wife of the couple, and she said, he is my uncle. So it is much more common than you would think, especially when dealing with patients that are from rural Pennsylvania. You get a lot of Amish patients coming in. You get a lot of patients from rural Mexico, like Oaxaca. A lot of what we call is consanguinity. That's when two people are related through their family. And then again, you get it from rural India as well. Those are the most common places that it happens. And it happens a lot more often than you think too. Getting into connective tissues, I think the hardest case I ever had to deal with, a little crash course on Marfan syndrome. Marfan syndrome, it's a genetic condition where your growth is not limited. So patients will be about 6'8" at 16 years old. And I kid you not, I saw a kid and his fingers were twice the length of mine. He was a phenom in basketball. We talked about it for about 10 minutes before his patient visit even started. And that's where the hard part comes in. When your growth is not limited, that also means that the growth of your capillaries, your aorta, your vena cava is not limited either. As those grow, it means that the walls get a lot thinner. That predisposes you to what's called an aortic dissection, and this guy was at the highest level of look out, like this might be an issue for him. So then that conversation turns into, what does your life look like outside of basketball? Because if you have an aortic dissection on the court, we cannot get you to a hospital in time to save your life. You need to stop playing this sport that has become your entire personality. Then during the visit, found out that he has a scholarship to Gonzaga to play basketball. I don't know if you know Gonzaga, if you look into March Madness, they are a very big basketball school. A lot of people go to the NBA from that school. So it can get hard. You can talk to patients about what their personality is how it's gonna change, how they've been sort of talked about at school, who their friend group is, how that might change because of genetic test results that they get. And it can get really difficult. Another example, cancer patient. I saw a guy who had pancreatic cancer. If you know about pancreatic cancer, you know it's a very aggressive and a rare form of cancer. He was in his 70s. He did not have kids. He had a sister and a brother who also did not have kids, and both his sister and brother had passed away. He was not in contact with any of his cousins. Typically what we would do is order genetic testing for those people so that they can sort of talk to their relatives and say, hey, I have this genetic mutation that caused my pancreatic cancer. You should get tested too. And that conversation turns into, well, you know, typically this is what we would order for you. Is it something that you would want? And he says yes. And we say, well, when we order this, just so you know, this isn't going to change the prognosis for your cancer. It takes about 3 weeks to get results from this testing. We don't know if it's going to get here before you pass away from the cancer. Having that conversation with someone in the clinic is not the easiest thing in the world, as one can imagine. But he wanted to do it anyway, because in his mind, it was closure for himself, potentially closure for his wife as well. And so it's navigating patient emotions and doing that counseling within the clinic, as well as the diagnosis and the typical stuff that you might see from a doctor of genetics or a PA within a genetics clinic. That's how it's different, that's how it's unique, and that's why I really enjoy it and why you might enjoy it too. As far as rotations go, there were some other things involved. Case conferences, that's where you basically get together with your floor. You talk with the nurses, the MDs, interesting cases that have come up, what you would have done differently, what they would have done differently, stuff like that. We have journal clubs where the greatest, newest, and brightest papers get brought to those same MDs, genetic counselors, and PhDs, where we talk about what they found, what was interesting, whether or not we think we want to enact this in some sort of treatment or practice that we use within the clinic. Then you have grand rounds, which is more educational, but basically every Friday morning at Stanford we go and we sit in with, oh man, it's almost about 90 different people. Everyone that's involved in genetics at all sits in on this, and we learn about the newest cases that have come in, and it's more of a brainstorming session really. A lot of the residents and the doctors will sort of talk about cases and be like, we're stumped, what do we do? Because this hasn't come back positive, this hasn't come back positive, so we have no idea why this kid has failure to thrive and can't put on weight no matter what we try. So it's fun, and it's a lot of detective work, really, is the best way to describe medicine and genetics and how they overlap. But yeah, it's enjoyable. You might think it is too. The final part for grad school and for any kind of master's or PhD program that you're going to do is a thesis project. Qualitative and quantitative are both utilized by people in programs. I like qualitative because I suck at R coding and I never want to do it ever again. LOI, your letter of intent, you have to come up with a good idea and say why you think it's a good idea. This can be very helpful when you're applying to schools. I don't even know how many times I've said it, but again, Theranos, I'm obsessed with the idea that you can get a blood prick and we know what's going to come up for you. My project is on exome and genome sequencing for non-symptomatic people, so healthy patients. Why would they want to get genetic testing? How can we market it to people? How can we convince them that this is something worth doing when you walk into the hospital? That's what my project's on. The top part actually is a transcript of an interview that I did with an individual who's healthy but also got their genome sequenced. So just sort of going through their brain, figuring out what's going on there. It's been really fun. Hi, Dr. Girl.
Hey, Bryce.
When it comes to IRB approval, that is the internal review board, what you have to do after you've submitted your LOI is talk to them and say, this is why it is a good idea. So your LOI is basically the proposal of the idea, and you have to defend it. That can get tricky, and you'll go through multiple rounds of basically revisions, and you'll have someone who volunteers. I don't know why they do it, because I'm sure they're reading a ton. But you'll probably revise your thesis idea about 3 to 4 or 5 times maybe. Another person in my program did it 10 times. So again, there's no limit to how many times it can be revised, but hopefully it's not too many. Then you can go on to grant funding. Word of advice, if you do get grant funding and you say, oh, it's going to be $500, well, it's only going to cost me about $390. don't say that, because I did, and that was a mistake, because then they said, oh great, we'll just give you $390 then. I'm like, oh shoot, I could have had $500 to work with here. But that's a big part as well of any kind of grad program that you're going to be in. Always submit for that. That'll be a huge thing to put on your resume down the road, because it is a big deal when you can get funding of any kind. Once you've secured all of that, the LOI is approved, the IRB is approved, you've got grant funding, then you can finally start with your research. And what I'm saying, I'm sure, sounds a little bit overwhelming, but don't worry, if your program is worth its salt, it will walk you through the process and it will not be all that bad. When it comes to your research being done, a lot of times people are going to want to hear about it. So you'll present it at a research colloquium, which will likely be at the end of your educational experience. Mine's coming up in June 16th to be exact. If you received funding, maybe those people that gave you the money are going to want to hear about your project too, so you'll present to them as well. With genetic counseling, we have the NSGC, so the National Society of Genetic Counselors. You can also submit your thesis to them and say, I would like to present this, and they'll say, yeah, that sounds great. We'll fly you out to Chicago or Miami or New York, or we had it recently in Nashville last year, and you can talk to about, oh man, how many people attended? There are like 600 to 700 genetic counselors that attend this event, and it's a really good time. I'll try doing that if that happens. I doubt it, but we'll see it. So, you have your bachelor's degree. Oh, excuse me. You have your bachelor's degree. You, in theory, have completed your master's degree in genetic counseling. You've gone through your board certification, which is a process that happens typically in August after you graduate. Some places will do it in February after you graduate, but you've got that board certification in this theoretical world. You've gone through your state licensure process, so you can work in California, you can work in Oklahoma, you can work in Massachusetts, wherever you want to go. Once you have all of this, it's time for you to get a job. So what kind of jobs can you have in a genetic counseling field? There are three main areas. There's the clinical work. The rotations that I talked about are big there. You can work in industry too. Industry biology is a big deal, and it's something that I didn't really understand when I was an undergrad at Point Loma. There are a lot of different ways that you can get involved there. Even without an advanced degree, I would recommend it for sure. And then you can also do public health, policy setting, and stuff like that. So, jumping into clinical, we talked a little bit about this already. There's a lot of stuff in the prenatal field. You've got neurological clinics, you've got metabolic clinics, cardiology, pediatrics, cancer clinics. You also have a bit of a unique piece of genetics is variant interpretation. We find every day that there are mutations that people have that we have never seen before and aren't in any databases, but they happen in this gene that we know can cause a certain condition. So let's look at the mutation. Let's look at what amino acid switches, what amino acid switches, whether or not that's going to impact the fold of the protein, whether or not that's going to impact the function of the overall system. And so then you'll come back and say to this MD, while we think that yes, this is going to impact our patient and it is a causative or a positive mutation. That's a pretty cool part of genetics that I really enjoy. And it's its own separate field. Every hospital has about 3 or 4 variant interpretation genetic counselors and a PhD or MD that specializes in genetics that do exactly that. When you're working in a clinical setting, you can work with doctors, you can work with PAs, you can work with physical therapists, you can work with speech and language pathologists, nurses, of course, and PhDs as well are all super helpful. And there are people that you'll talk to every day, they'll become your best friends, and it's a really good time. When it comes to working with other genetic counselors, it depends on where you are, but let's say you're in a more rural clinic, you'll probably be the only genetic counselor at that hospital, outpatient care facility, etc. A place like Rady's Children's Hospital has about 4 for their entire hospital. An outpatient clinic at, say, even in Palo Alto, only has 2. And one of them will likely specialize in adult medicine, and the other will specialize in pediatric medicine. And that changes from place to place. If you're at Stanford Medical, there are, on the prenatal floor alone, 18 genetic counselors. A lot more depending on what you're looking for, what kind of care you're giving to patients. Obviously, prenatal is going to have a lot more because you have a lot more people coming in. But something that's a little bit more rare, like metabolics, you might only have 2 or 3. You can also go into industry. As you can imagine, the pay increase in industry is sizable. So it's something that you might interest you. Being in San Diego, Illumina is something that I bet you guys have possibly driven by an Illumina building at some point. They're huge in the genetic space. Companies like Ambry, which is up in Aliso Viejo, Laguna, California. If you've ever driven on that toll road, it's really great. It's way better than 405 in my opinion, but I also don't want to pay for it. So Ambry is right off of that toll road. Invitae, Natera, GeneDx, all these companies are different companies that are involved in genetics. They do the creation and research behind new genetic testing. So what you would do in a genetics clinic is say, we want to get you this cancer panel that covers 91 different genes. We're going to order it from Ambry. So what Ambry does is they have people that are hospital liaisons. In order to get clinical people to use your products, you need to create a relationship with those clinical people. And so what they'll do is schmooze a little bit with the genetic counselors, with the geneticists, bring in some cookies or something like that. Not entirely legal, but a lot of people tend to look the other way. What's best is when a genomic liaison comes in and says, hey, we're having this educational seminar. Oh, it's also at the La Jolla Fleming Steakhouse. You should come. We'll cover food. And that is really great too. Within industry, you can also do traditional counseling. Sometimes people don't want to go to the doctor in order to order a genetic test, and so they'll go straight to the company, so you'll be their genetic counselor. You can do reporting, where you find new results from genetic tests and call them out to clinical people or to patients themselves. You can do product design. You can say, we think that we really need to involve this new gene because of this new paper that came out, so let's throw it onto our cancer panel, let's throw it onto our prenatal panel. You can also do more research. Companies always want more PhDs, more ethicists on their boards to talk about what can be included or what's new, what's coming out. The slimier part, well, you know what, I shouldn't say that. There are a lot of great people that are involved in insurance. Companies will have insurance personnel, genetic counselors specialized in insurance, that know whether or not the company is getting scammed. So these insurance companies will have a genetic counselor to say, no, you can't make us pay for this because it doesn't make any sense for us to order this for this patient. And we'll have a little bit of a back and forth. As a clinical genetic counselor, they'll say, no, I really want this, and here's why. Here's my letter of medical necessity that says this is important for this patient. You can't refute this. And the person that works for the genetic counselor that works for the insurance agency will say, no, here's this paper, and that paper that say why this isn't important, and you're just trying to get a free test out of us. So the back and forth of business and the American healthcare system is ever present. Yeah.
So also in research, I can verify that variant interpretation is becoming really big in industry.
That's huge.
Because like for our company, we have genetic testing from patients. We're trying to figure out what causes the disease, and so there's about hundreds of different genes that have these changes. Which one's most likely to have a variant that we care about? And then also, if you're designing these genetic tests, you need to find the right variants that are actually going to be causative.
Exactly.
So that's huge knowledge.
Yeah, and it's a fun part too. It's like, it's not traditional genetic counseling, but it's sort of utilizing the knowledge that you have and putting it into practice in different ways. It's a lot of fun. When you're in the industry, you won't necessarily be working with MDs, but you can. Typically though, you're going to be working with PhDs. You'll work with the marketing team and account managers and directors that are talking to the hospitals you're trying to get your product utilized in. And then you can also talk with legal correspondents, lawyers and stuff, and say, well, this insurance company is doing this thing and I want them to do that thing, and yada yada, etc., stuff like that. The final area that you can use a genetic counseling degree is in public health. This one's really fun. There are a lot of genetic counselors that turn to higher education. They teach genetics, as one can imagine. There's also more research that's coming out. Again, research is big everywhere. Clinical, industry, public health domain, sponsored by the government, done privately. Anyone and everyone can get involved. The best part is, when it comes to public health, or the most exciting part in my opinion, is the lobbying. So there are many bills on the House floor, on the Senate floor, that are involving genetics, involving research, involving patient care. And so a lot of times, groups like the NSGC or the American Community of Genetic Counselors, something like that, but they'll send genetic counselors to Capitol Hill in order to lobby as an expert, in order to convince people on both sides of the aisle, this is a bill that we think is important, and we really want you to push it through. And that can be really fun. One area of Stanford that I've really enjoyed participating in is Stanford Hill Day, where we are basically on a Zoom call with different senators and state representatives, and we're talking to them about these different bills that they have, why we want them to get pushed through, how it can impact us as researchers, as people in the scientific field. I talked with Mark Kelly, the Arizona senator, and I also talked with Lauren Bogart, the Colorado state representative. So both sides of the aisle, we don't discriminate what party you're from. We just want you to understand that this is important to us. We want you to be supportive of it too. Another part of it is you can be involved in policy making itself. The CDC is something that I'm sure we're all aware of now, and the NIH are both larger bodies of researching individuals and professionals that can be involved in making policy towards genetics, involved in sort of creating the guidelines for what testing should be and what it should look like, and that's something you can get involved in too. So hopefully I've given you a good idea of the who, what, when, where, why, and how of genetic counseling, when it would be involved and why it would be important. We can talk more about the grad school application process, what it was like for me, questions you might have about it, go through your experiences of classes, rotations, research that I've had. I have a ton of, I wouldn't call them horror stories, they're just really fun, interesting stories from clinic. And if you have more questions about jobs within the genetic counseling field, again, there are many, and hopefully you've seen that as well. So thanks so much for listening to me ramble on a little bit here. You can scan that QR code. Like I said at the beginning, this is being done for my own class assignment, so you're helping me graduate here. You can just put my name, the date, the topic is this is a public educational event, and then put your own name as well as any kind of feedback you might have. But yeah, if anyone's got questions, let me know.